Hello, everyone. My name is Sam Schaefer with the Poultry Science Association. Our guest today is Casey Owens with the University of Arkansas. Casey, why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and your area of expertise?
Hi, thank you for having me on here today. So yes, I'm a professor in poultry science at the University of Arkansas, and my area of expertise is in meat science, poultry processing, meat quality, and so I do research and also teaching at the university.
Well, we are excited to have you today, Casey. And on this episode of Squawk About It, we are going to discuss the differences between red and white meat. Now, this comes up because earlier this year during IPPE, when things were a little bit normal for all of us, I received a postcard from AMSA regarding the definitions of meat. So I want to know if it's kind of something new or if it's something that you guys have had around for a while and you're trying to increase awareness about it.
So a couple of years ago, I worked with a team of scientists through the American Meat Science Association to develop a meat science lexicon. And that was really to define a lot of terminology for the science community in particular, but also for consumers and whatnot. But so that we could use similar terminology across the board, because there have been some reports out there, some nutrition reports, for example, that might say red meats cause cancer or something like that. So it has a negative connotation, but that's a very broad statement, and it's doesn't really define what the meaning is of that statement, for example. And so there's just a push to really streamline what the definitions were and so forth.
Okay, gotcha. So with that being said, trying to streamline the definitions of meat, let's discuss the definition of meat itself. So what would you define meat as?
So again, I'm going to kind of refer to some of the meat science lexicon that we did develop in terms of what the definition of meat is. And so I want to read that definition to you real quick. Meat, it's a skeletal muscle and its associated tissue derived from mammalian, avian, reptilian, amphibian, and aquatic species harvested for human consumption. So that is one definition of meat. And then we'll get into, we hear red meat and white meat quite a bit. And so some of the history along with those terms come from really when the United States began inspecting meat or harvest of meat from animals. So the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was established to determine wholesomeness of what was considered red meat species. And at that time, that was defined beef, swine, sheep, goats, and horse. Poultry really wasn't processed on a wide scale at that time, and so that wasn't really included. And so the Poultry Products Inspection Act of 1957 was then developed to bring on inspection for poultry. And so that's kind of where the white meat terms came in, because meat from lighter colored avian species were referred to more the white meat groups, and as compared to red meats. So it is important to note, though, that both poultry has red and white meat. And so that, for example, the breast meat would be an example of white meat, and the thigh meat or drumstick would be an example of the red meat. And so the differentiation between those two groups is really about function. One being a locomotive muscle. For example, the thigh is used for locomotion, and then the breast muscle for birds, chickens, they don't fly, so that it's really has a different metabolic activity associated with it.
That's interesting, that poultry, a lot of people probably perceive as being a white meat kind of meat, but in reality, it is comprised of both white and red meat. That's very interesting.
Yes.
Not something I knew, so learned something right there. So that act, it sounds like my next question was what prompted like a terminology adjustment within white meat or poultry, and it sounds like that act, the Poultry Act, is what kind of prompted that change, right?
Yeah, so the Poultry Products Inspection Act of 1957, that really established inspection regulations for poultry, and and obviously 1957 was a long time ago, and the industry has really developed since then. But the U.S. consumers really prefer breast meat, and so that's kind of is the reason that white meat is really more the focus, and why poultry is considered white meat. Because that is more the muscle of choice, although the thigh and the drumstick, the whole leg, are very popular choices as well. There's age differences between poultry and how they're marketed versus beef and how they're marketed. So there are differences in some of those muscle types. For example, muscles from beef, which have more myoglobin, and myoglobin is just one of those proteins that's included in that muscle type that would allow for oxygen to be carried within the muscle. And so those animals that require more oxygen capacity or have more oxygen demand, for example, in locomotion, then they're going to have more myoglobin, and that tends to make that meat darker in color. And so the same thing with thigh meat that has more myoglobin because it needs to have more oxygen carried to the meat for it to function, compared to the breast meat, which is lower in myoglobin content.
And we could probably have a whole discussion on nutritional differences on red versus white meat, even just within a chicken itself. So we won't get into all of that, but I think that's another interesting topic that we could delve upon in the future at some point. But then my final question here was about red versus white meat and what determines red meat over white meat. I know we kind of talked about that already, and we talked about how poultry can consist of red and white meat. And I know we mostly aim to discuss poultry, but one of the things I wanted to bring up is I noticed on this postcard that I had received right here, it touched on pork, which I thought was interesting because pork had been promoted as the other white meat. So I think it's interesting that according to this postcard, it lists pork under red meat. So I was curious to ask your thoughts on that, or some insight onto that as to why pork was labeled a red meat, and if there are any differences kind of similar to poultry with how some parts are white, some parts are red. So kind of wanted to dive into the pork aspect of that, just because it was interesting and kind of went against what pork has popularly been promoted as.
I think, and I'm not a pork expert, but swine has muscles that have intermediate fibers, so that kind of have combinations, red and white fibers within them. But I think the other white meat came really from a marketing term, and it was a way to compete with poultry, showing that it's light meat, a little bit less fat, and so forth. And I believe that's kind of how that came about. But they do have muscles that have red fibers as well. Again, the red fibered muscles, and that's the whole terminology about red meat, is really about function of the muscle. So locomotive type muscles that are going to require more endurance, require more oxygen to function. And that's kind of where that comes along. But some of their cuts do have some lighter fibers, some white fibers within their muscles, and they market those as popular cuts.
Very insightful. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I appreciate you joining me for a little bit today, Casey, to talk on this. We appreciate you joining us. Is there anything else you want to say about red or white meat before we sign off here?
Of course, I'm a big fan of poultry, but I like all meats in general. So again, the whole terminology of red and white meat, and the whole reason we went to develop that lexicon was really for publications and so forth, were to really describe the meat properly, so that we don't have really broad statements that are too negative or positives, that we can really hone in on to interpret research.
Wonderful. And we will link in the information found on this postcard passed out at IPPE in our description of this video. Casey, thanks again for joining me today for PSA. My name is Sam Schaefer. Casey, we'll talk to you later.
All right. Thank you.